Section 5, we'll be looking at the energy sources needed for contraction of skeletal muscle, but also remember that muscle relaxation also requires energy in the form of ATP. Part of that is because you have to have the energy to pump back in using active transport to pump back in the calcium that we mentioned before into the storage area, the sarcoplasmic reticulum. You have to have energy to detach the myosin to basically break the cross bridge for the myosin heads from the actin myofilaments, and then also energy to reestablish the sodium and potassium levels to get that resting membrane potential back, and that uses a sodium potassium ATP driven pump. So when you look at where some of this ATP comes from, for muscle cells anyway, there's a chemical called creatine phosphate. And what this does is the phosphate helps to add this phosphate unit to ADP. Now, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. The T stands for tri, that means 3. So this is a nucleic acid. It's got 3 phosphate groups attached to it, and the energy is inside this molecule is in these bonds, in these phosphate bonds. And so whenever you use some of that ATP energy, you're basically breaking the bond down so that you can release the energy. So if you break one of these bonds, you're left with ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So you just have 2 phosphates. So to energize it, it's kind of like a rechargeable battery. To recharge this molecule of ADP, you have to add phosphate to it. So creatine phosphate is added to ADP, and then you're left over with a chemical called creatine, and then you have your fully charged molecule now called ATP. This is just one type of way that you get ATP energy in the muscle cells. Now this gives you a very small amount, and they estimate this only lasts for about 8 to 10 seconds worth of muscle contractions. So you obviously need more energy. And so another place you'll get it is anaerobic respiration. The word anaerobic here means without oxygen. This is where your cells, mainly your muscle cells, can break down break down glucose without needing oxygen, and that'll produce ATP. Now, it does produce a byproduct called lactic acid that can build up in your muscle cells and give you cramps. And so, but it does produce a little bit of ATP, but it's not very much. Along with the creatine phosphate that we just mentioned, you have just several minutes of muscle contraction ability using these 2 energy sources. Then you have a third type of energy source called aerobic respiration. Aerobic, the word means oxygen or air, and so this requires oxygen, it uses oxygen, and that helps to break down glucose and several different processes, which you'll look at in Bio 169. You'll go through, and you may have seen these before in some high school biology, or Bio 111, you'll talk about glycolysis, and you'll talk about the citric acid cycle and electron transport, all these different parts of cell respiration or aerobic respiration. It's how most of your muscle cells create the energy that they need, and it makes a lot. It makes 36 ATP molecules. It does produce carbon dioxide. That's kind of a waste product. You have to get rid of that. And it does make a little bit of metabolic water. And this is much more efficient than the anaerobic type of respiration. Now, in section 6, we'll look briefly at muscle tension at the cellular level, at the fiber level. And you see the word up here, muscle twitch. This is just what's whenever a muscle contracts and relaxes. It goes through a contraction cycle and relaxation cycle, and that's a muscle twitch. It's just a very brief contraction and relaxation, but it's a complete cycle. And if you take a look at the graph here, you can kind of see you have a contraction that goes up. This is kind of looking at the tension of a muscle. Contraction goes up, and relaxation goes down. It happens very, very quickly. And we're talking about, on a thousandth of a second. This is 40 milliseconds. And the other thing to kind of mention, though, I like how this graph shows this, is that you have the action potential that comes first, right? So here's your action potential. That gets generated, your depolarization and repolarization like we've seen before, and that's what triggers that muscle twitch. So after you have the action potential, you're going to have that contraction, and then you have the relaxation. There are two different types of muscle fibers. There's a slow twitch and a fast twitch type muscle fiber. Slow twitch is also called type 1 muscle fiber. They're called slow because they do contract more slowly, but they contract with much more strength. They're relatively a little smaller in diameter as far as the cell is. Generally have more blood supply to this area. The cells usually have more mitochondria. Mitochondria, of course, is making the energy, the ATP energy that they need, so they have more energy supply. They have a large amount of a protein called myoglobin. You may have heard of hemoglobin before. Hemoglobin is what's in your blood cells to help to carry oxygen. Well, you have a very similar type of protein in the muscle cells called myoglobin, and that also helps to carry oxygen. So you have a large oxygen supply. A lot of mitochondria, so more energy, more oxygen here. And so these types of muscle fibers are more fatigue resistant. They don't tire out as easily. And so some of your strong type muscles, like in your back, your postural muscles that have to work continuously to support your, the body's torso, and your lower limbs, your thigh area, your muscles in your lower limbs, especially your upper thigh. These types of muscles that just require a lot of strength, a lot of support, a lot of energy, and a lot of blood supply. The fast twitch type muscles, type 2 muscles, they're called fast twitch because they're very quick as far as their reflex action. They respond very rapidly whenever the nerve sends a signal. They can process the ATP very quickly. They don't have as much blood supply. They have fewer mitochondria. They still have a lot of mitochondria for energy, but they don't have as many as your type 1 cells do. And because of that, they do wear out or kind of fatigue, get tired a little quicker. And so sprinters, sometimes the lower limb muscles, lower leg muscles, and upper limbs are where you're going to find your fast type muscles. Section 7 talks about a motor unit, and a motor unit is basically everything that you need for a complete muscle contraction. So you would need the neuron that's involved, you would need the muscle fibers that's involved, you would need the blood flow, the capillaries, you would need all of the parts of the muscle cell that would be involved to create that contraction. And the bundles, the fasciculus, we've talked about some of the terminology before, all of these different things. And so motor units, if you have a lot of different fibers, if you have a lot of cells, usually you find these in larger muscles. Larger muscles are going to have more motor units and more fibers in the motor units, but usually that means you have a little bit less precision control. For muscles that you need more delicate type movements or more control movements, such as eye muscles or muscles in the fingers, so you have more dexterity, you would have fewer number of fibers, and so that allows you to have better control because you have more nerves going to a fewer number of fibers. Now let's talk a little bit about muscle strength. Muscle strength can increase and give you better muscle performance in really one of two ways. You can either increase, how strong the muscle fiber is contracting. That's called summation. You're getting more of these, you're getting more muscle fibers to contract at the same time. That gives you more force, more contraction force, and that's called summation. Or you can have more muscle fibers contracting at the same time, and that's a recruitment type of scenario. So whenever you're exercising, you're really not changing the number of muscle fibers or muscle cells that you have, but they're actually changing in size. They're actually growing. And so here's a couple of vocabulary words for you. Hypertrophy, the first word, means that the muscle is increasing in size. The reason is you're increasing the actin and myosin proteins inside. The myofilaments increase their size inside of the muscle cells. The nuclei increase. You have stronger muscles because you have better, more organized motor units. You have more metabolism, more circulation. All these things help in the process to increase the muscle size. And then atrophy is the opposite here. That's a decrease in muscle size. And And so that just means kind of pretty much the reverse of these conditions. Your myofilaments, they start to break down, and they start to break down, and they get fewer in number. The nuclei start to break down. You have less circulation. All these types of things cause your muscles to become weaker and decrease in size. Now, there is a phenomenon known as TREPA. That just means that this is a measurement of the contraction force of muscles, and they've noticed that if you successively give a stimulus to a muscle, it actually starts to increase its tension, its force. It contracts with a greater force up until a certain point. TREPA kind of means like staircase or stepwise. So if you take a look at the graph, let's say you have a muscle, a stimulus on a muscle to create an action potential, and the stimulus is all the same strength. Stimulus is constant strength. The stimulus hasn't changed. It just kind of hits it kind of quickly, but that's going to trigger your muscles to kind of get a little stronger up until a certain point, and then it all kind of levels off. And so the idea behind this is that perhaps the calcium levels, remember calcium has to go back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Maybe you're not given enough time to get all that calcium in there, so they're a little bit more ready to have a muscle contraction. It's not resetting itself completely, so the next muscle contraction will be a little stronger. There's also something called multiple motor unit summation. This is helping to make your muscles stronger by increasing the number of motor units that are being controlled by a particular nerve and a particular muscle group. And so the idea here, though, is if you have a stimulus to increase in strength, because you have more motor units, you have a stronger stimulus, you can have a stronger muscle contraction. So on this, the y-axis here is muscle contraction strength or tension. How strong is that muscle contracting? You notice it's going up to a certain point. It's going up because you're getting a stronger stimulus at each time. And so there is a maximum, though, that where you can, you can't really have any stronger stimulus. You're still going to have the same amount of muscle contraction force after a certain point. Now, they've also noticed that, increasing how quickly an action potential takes place also gives you an increase in the contraction. So, the quicker it is, the more contractions you'll have. And so here again, it's kind of a little muscle twitch. You got an action potential, and it responds. Your muscle responds with a twitch. And so the faster it comes in, the faster here you kind of sped it up a little bit. You've got faster action potentials coming in, and that creates a little stronger type of a tension, but it starts getting to something called tetanus. Tetanus here, or tetany here, is where you're not giving the muscle enough time to relax in between action potentials. Now the action potentials are coming in so quickly that the muscle doesn't have time to relax, and so it stays in a state of contraction for a longer or extended amount of time. So a couple of words up here: incomplete tetanus. That's where this little second and third area here, the muscle fibers are partially relaxing between contraction, but they're starting to have a problem, going through their relaxation stage. Complete tetanus is where no relaxation is taking place between the contractions, but you do see an increase in contraction force from 1 to 2 to 3 and even to 4. That's called multiple wave summation, where the contraction force of the muscle is going up as your frequency is increasing. The faster you have a stimulus, the stronger the muscle contraction is going to be. Now, eventually muscles get tired. They fatigue, and so fatigue is defined as decreased capacity to work or reduced efficiency and performance. And usually that's because of one of three things. Most of the time when we think of muscle fatigue, it's just psychological fatigue. It's not that something's wrong. It's just that you're starting to get tired, and your brain is kind of telling you your muscles are tired, and you just don't feel like getting up, and that affects your emotional state. And so this is why you cheer at a sporting event, to kind of get the athletes a little bit more emotionally involved. and that kind of gives them the strength to kind of go through the play or whatever. And so muscular fatigue is different, because muscular fatigue means that for some reason you're not producing the adequate amounts of ATP, and that means you can't get those muscles to contract. It's not that you just don't want to, or you're tired or something. You just don't have the physical ability to do this because the ATP reserves are depleted. Synaptic fatigue is similar to this, but this is more of something's going wrong with the neuromuscular junction. That's the NMJ abbreviation there. For some reason, you don't have the acetylcholine, and it's not, causing the action potential to be generated like it should. And so something is wrong physiologically inside of that synapse area. Now, the last couple sections here, we'll look at smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. We're not going to go through a lot of these areas. They'll be talked about in other chapters, but there are a few things to kind of point out about each one of these. Smooth muscle, we mentioned before briefly. It is non-striated, and that's just because the way that it still has the actin and the myosin myofilaments, but they're not arranged in the same way as a skeletal muscle is. So you don't see the same types of striations. They're very smooth looking when you look at it on the microscopic level. The muscle fibers themselves are smaller. They're not long and cylindrical like skeletal muscles are. They're almost like what they call spindle shaped. So they're kind of curved a little bit like this, rather than long and cylindrical. They generally have just a single nucleus, relatively centrally located nucleus. Remember, skeletal muscle fibers have many nuclei. And the actin and myosin, because they are differently arranged, they have some proteins that help to attach them inside of the sarcoplasm or the cytoplasm, and inside of the sarcolemma. And so the actin myofilament is actually attached to something called dense bodies. And the diagram kind of shows these dense bodies that's connecting the actin myofilaments within the sarcoplasm. And then the myosin myofilaments is actually connected to the sarcolemma, the actual cell membrane. And the third type of muscle tissue is cardiac muscle. And so let's just review a few things about cardiac muscle. Of course, it's only found in the heart. It is striated, so it does have the same type of arrangement of the actin and myosin myofilaments as skeletal muscle, so you do see the striations there. However, each of the cardiac muscle cells only has a single nucleus. It does have, cardiac muscle does have what are called intercalated disc and gap junctions, and so these are just the connections. We talked about these before back in chapter 4, I believe it is. These are the connections that kind of hold the cells together very closely, and the gap junctions are basically little pores that allow for the action potential, the electrical signal, to pass through more quickly, so that cardiac muscle cells can receive the action potential a lot faster. And then they also are autorhythmic cells. They are basically like pacemaker cells. You have a certain type of cardiac muscle cells in the heart that create an autorhythmic type of a action potential. It regulates itself, and that helps to keep the heart beating in time